Scholar in Residence program here at Mount Olive. This program is made possible by, I sound like I'm on public television. This program is made possible by a generous grant from the Mount Olive Foundation. And I mean that in all sincerity and seriousness, because we couldn't pull this off without their support. The purpose of the Scholar in Residence program is to give us a chance to spend some time with an acknowledged scholar in a particular area over a period of time, more than like the 1 or 2 presentations that we're able to arrange through the rest of the adult forum here. And so we have some money that enables us to get a more prolonged program to enhance the education budget, and it's really great. And it is both fitting and proper that our first scholar in residence should be a friend of Mount Olive, someone who's been here before, and you know, we like to know that at least the first person's going to have some quality when we get him up here. And we know that for a fact in the case of Earl Schwartz. Many of you have been in the programs that he's led here at Mount Olive before and tug on my coat saying, when can we get him back? When can we get him back? And the answer to that is today, and tomorrow, next week, and the week after that, and the week after that. Earl will be here for 4 successive Sundays to give him enough time to sort of open up the topic that he has chosen. You will find on your seats that there is a handout relating to his presentation, along with a Bible, which I trust will prove to be useful in the course of this as well. Some of you have NRSVs, I'm not talking either, and some of you have NIVs, but we should be able to deal with that. You've known Earl. He professes theology, social justice at Hamlin. And it's really great that he could take 4 weeks in a row to spend some time with us. So welcome back. We really appreciate it. And what it does is it's magnetized like that, so it goes on a lapel or a shirt collar or something like that. And then you can put this in your hole, and it's on. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the foundation. Thank you to the congregation. I'm honored and delighted to see so many friends this morning. Good to see you. And I look forward to these weeks together. Why are we here? And by here I mean Minnesota. I begin not with the existential question, but yeah. The intricacies of Scripture seem far less daunting than figuring out how to negotiate the way from Falcon Heights, Minnesota to but I'm delighted to. Books are, of course, very powerful things. But they are also inherently limited and potentially limiting things as well. Lutherans, Jews, members of any living tradition rooted in written documents, Americans all, come to know both the power and limits of writing. Much of what we'll be talking about in the next few weeks will move between that power and those limits. And I want to spend much of our time this morning laying out some premises in that regard, having to do with reading in general and reading Hebrew Bible in translation in particular. Plato, you might remember, ruminates at length about this. Ruminates and does so as a bit of a, well, there's a certain rascal involved in this aspect of Plato's work. He ruminates in part, he thinks so, ponders the fact that he is observing the retreat of teachers like his own beloved Socrates before the advance of writers like himself. one of the things that runs through the base of Plato's work is this acute awareness of the distinction in medium between how he learned and how he chooses to teach. Writers like himself, who was a man who, after all, ironically, purported to write dialogues. And he knew in a way that is hard for us to recapture today what a strange, paradoxical notion that would be, writing a dialogue. In one of these so-called dialogues, the Phaedrus, he has his mentor, Socrates, muse about these matters, the difference between speaking and reading, writing and listening. And in the Phaedrus, Socrates retells a legend about how the art of writing came as a gift from the Egyptian god Thoth to the then reigning pharaoh. As Thoth hands over this secret art, the art of writing, to this pharaoh, Thoth declares, "Now people will never forget." And the pharaoh replies, "It's one thing to invent. It's another thing to understand how the invention will be used. Not so. Now people will never remember." Books pretend to speak, Socrates argues, but one sees the limit when faced with ever-changing circumstances. Written words seem to start to mumble, repeat themselves, to turn away, to go opaque. And then they have to be rescued by real dialogue. And Plato knew exactly what he meant by this. Not something that you would read in a book, but living human beings, face to face, seeking meaning together. Books always have to be rescued by living speech between living human beings. Wisdom, Plato declares, wisdom is realized in the speech that passes between people. Books are at best a reminder, an image, a passing shadow of that speech. Interestingly enough, biblical authors, though for the most part writing long before Plato, also were aware of this irony, this paradox, even as the Hebrew Bible was passing from spoken oral saga to written document. Biblical authors also draw a clear distinction between written and spoken words. There are lots of examples of this. I'll just give you one in particular. Time and again, they recount that effective words, the words that matter, the words that do the work, the words that accomplish, are spoken words. Words spoken between people. Words heard between people. And then, and only then, recorded. And I suppose the best example of this would be the Ten Commandments, as the narrative renders them. We are prone to imagine, to capture, as it were, the Decalogue in the form of 2 stone tablets. And isn't that all too human? We like our sacred words in stone, and so we think of those words as Moses brought them down. But the important thing to keep in mind is that the revelation itself is never the tablets. They are never spoken of in those terms. At best, in the biblical narrative regarding the revelation of the covenant at Sinai, those tablets are described as evidence. They have a certain forensic validity, but they're not the words. They're the record, at best, they're the shadow, they're an imprint, they're a footprint, they're an image. But the words that did the deal were the words that the people heard face to face at Sinai. The spoken word between speaker and listener. And so all of the elaborate preparations and the pyrotechnics and the drama, as God first says, I want you to hear me say these things, and then they're committed to writing. The tablets are, and the scriptural authors know this, and they know this ironically as they turn from narrators to writers. The tablets are a frozen record of once fluid spoken words. So reading the Bible is a reading of a record of words. Reading the Bible is the reading of a record of words. 2 or 3 times displaced from the moment they were spoken. And that displacement once was clear and obvious to those who turned to the written text for a reminder of what those words once may have been like when first heard. We read from books, but that record originated with these suppositions. That these words that we find in the book, talk about an illusion, huh? There's an illusion for you. There's an illusion that speaks volumes. The limits of a book, huh? As if you got it there. Oh, I got it now. I got the Word of God right there in my hand. Well, you know, if it were the Word spoken, you could never do that. You never get away with that. I've got the Word. We like it this way. We like it between the covers of the book. But these were words, and even as they were being committed to writing at the end of the biblical period, these were words that people well knew were composed for the ear rather than the eye. And words that would be transmitted originally and continue to be transmitted primarily through speech, even when the Hebrew Bible became increasingly identified as a document, even when the earliest oral traditions of the biblical Israelites came to be collected and came to be collated in the scriptural text that we have today, people still realized that the words had been intended to be heard, that they would continue to be intended to be heard, that people would come to experience these words most often, not reading them, but having them read to them, still from mouth to ear. Words transmitted primarily through speech, even after biblical texts emerged, until about the time of Luther. And the Hebrew Bible was a very, very old set of words by them. Persevering in this way, in this duality, words first intended to be spoken and heard, then intended to be read and heard by others, only finally, in the last few hundred years, expected to be read alone by individuals. These words have persevered in this reading through shifting layers of culture and language for 3 millennia. So, whatever transpires in the next few weeks regarding the opening chapters of Genesis, I hope will be taken, first of all, as intended to convey that I study this text with considerable reserve regarding what might ever be heard or recovered from the initial experience of hearing the word as it was once spoken. That initial reserve, I think, serves me well. and it will be implicit in anything that transpires in the next few weeks. I want to be a little more specific, though, about the technicalities that go along with this foundational expectation that written words are but an image of what a spoken word might convey. I'll talk about the Hebrew language. I also want to talk about common narrative conventions that can be discerned in most biblical stories. And then finally about what's different about these opening chapters of Genesis from almost anything else that you find in the Hebrew Bible. So those are my objectives for today. Talk a little bit about the Hebrew language, a little bit about common narrative structures that one finds in biblical story, and then finally what sets these opening chapters apart. Before I go on, any questions or comments about what I've said thus far? Yes, please.
It's fascinating. Just listening to you talk, if I had reading what you said,
Yeah.
totally different.
It
No
is.
inflection. And
Absolutely.
what makes me think of music, when you write music, you put all these expression things, crescendo,
Yes.
staccato, legato. You don't do that with writing,
Yes, that's
except a little italics maybe.
That's exactly what I intend. And you know, it's the rare genius who looks at a musical score and hears the music. Most of us look at the musical score, and even if we're good at music, what we see first of all is notes, and we're already distracted from what in fact that might be about. That's absolutely right. Yes, thank you. Anything else? This is, by the way, this is a very painful realization to the extent that we rely on this book. We lean on it. The security of having the book is a great comfort, and a great comfort in very human ways. And I'm afraid Scripture often is eager to make us reconsider the price we pay for that comfort. So we're on our way to reflecting on that. Let me say a little bit about the Hebrew language. And I believe there are some here among us who are familiar with Hebrew. So this will be reviewed, and for others maybe heard for the first time. We're going to be looking at texts that we know only in biblical Hebrew, first of all. If they are derived in turn to some extent or influenced by other languages, the text as we have it today is thoroughly Hebraicized. Those other languages would almost certainly be Semitic, so some of the characteristics, the language of the text itself would be shared with those other traditions that have influenced the Hebrew Bible, but we're looking at text that conforms to the standards, to the model that Hebrew provides. And that is important to keep in mind because, of course, languages shape the way we perceive the world, the way we think, the way we see. Which leads me, I might have told this story before, but please allow me to tell it again, to our beloved, late, great fire-bellied toad, which was one of the many animals that our children prevailed upon us to buy for them when they were growing up. We had a guinea pig, we had a dog, we had 2 mice, we had a toad. The list goes on and on. But here's the thing about the toad, and it sheds great light on Scripture. Bella, as we call her, like many similar creatures, had to have live food. Bella couldn't eat anything inanimate. And it was, of course, it was my job to buy the crickets. Who else was going to buy the crickets? Dad, go buy the crickets. So I'd go buy a bag of crickets, and it was my job to take the crickets out of the bag and put the crickets in the terrarium. And I would do this every couple of weeks. So there was a little drama that ensued as soon as the crickets went into the terrarium. If you've ever had an animal that had to eat live food, you know the drama. The cricket would go into the terrarium, 1 or 2. Bella, who might be looking around, might be hopping, would freeze. freakies. But Bella's great gift, this was a gift of character. This demonstrated depth of moral fiber in Bella was Bella could wait forever. Sort of like Siddhartha and Hesse's Siddhartha, right? Could wait, yeah. Bella could wait forever. And sooner or later, the poor cricket got an itch. And the cricket would go. And then Bella was on that cricket, and with her toad arms was pushing this cricket in. And then there'd be a moment of ecstatic reflection as the cricket was half in and half out. And then the rest of it was out. Now, why do I tell you that? I tell you that because languages have distinctive semantic and syntactical and grammatical characteristics. And Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, has the rather interesting characteristic, first of all, of employing no verbs of being. Nothing simply is in biblical Hebrew. We've talked about this in the past, but I want to say it again because it has a lot to do with what we'll see in these opening chapters of Genesis. Nothing simply is. In order to be realized in the world, you have to act. You have to act discernibly. You have to engage the environment and move in such a way as to make your existence realized in the action. You are as you do. You might not exactly be you are what you do, but close. You are at least as you do. That's how you become perceptible in the action. Like that poor cricket. Bella had the kind of vision that could only see motion. And until the cricket moved, it was, functionally speaking, not there for Bella. And the moment it moved, the cricket became real. That's what Hebrew does to those who think in classical Hebrew terms. Modern Hebrew doesn't work this way anymore. Modern Hebrew has been westernized and does employ terms as the equivalent of verbs of being. But if you imagine what it would mean to experience the world with no way of expressing presence or being or existence apart from actions that realize that presence, being, or existence. That even tables really do stand in the room. They didn't stand there, they wouldn't be there because be there isn't there. Makes sense? So, one of the things we're going to be watching for is the way in which these early biblical narratives express this notion of real through function, through action, through doing. The way in which Bible describes is quite far removed from what we typically think of as descriptive function. It's not very visual. It's not very visual because it can't capture things in a picture. It doesn't give you pictures. Think of this for a moment. And then we're just one step away from what the Bible means by idolatry. One step away. You cannot capture reality in a picture. Anywhere. People often say, the reason why you get these goofy renderings of Noah's Ark and why people are so often misled into drawing a boat when if you put what's being described in the Hebrew Bible as Noah's Ark together, you get a box, not a boat, is because the text never gets around to telling you what it looks like. There is no visual description of the ark. In fact, there is no visual description of almost anything in the Hebrew Bible that was highly visual in our terms. Instead, you're told how you make it and what it does. It's made real by function, like the world. So when we get to the opening verses of Genesis and talk about the creative process that's described there, it's going to be important to keep this in mind. Let me also say, in a broader sense, this will be the only other thing that I want to say about Hebrew. Aside from that rather dramatic distinction and its importance for our conversation, and the ways in which this no verb of being, real through action, touches on almost everything important in Hebrew Bible. I think it's also important to keep in mind that language never simply means what it means by what words denote. By that I mean, nobody becomes truly functional in a language if what they think that entails is establishing a correspondence between what the definition in the dictionary says a word means and what you intend. That's a disastrous way to approach language. In fact, words always, if they function well, function in an unspoken field of meaning. And they drag that field of meaning along with them wherever they go. And it's assumed that if words work well, it's because you share that unspoken field of meaning. Unless you do, dictionaries are minimal help. Take away that experiential common ground, and you remove the frame of reference for much of what we typically intend to convey by words. And in the case of the Hebrew Bible, this is a doubly difficult problem, as the cultural distances we're going to cross extend over millennia, and the fact that the Hebrew Bible itself was composed over a millennium of time, and those cultural differences were already ensuing in the course of the composition of the text itself. So connotation is a very subtle but crucial aspect of language, and we're looking at a connotative phenomenon in biblical text that is difficult from multiple directions. There are all sorts of words in Hebrew Bible for which we have no shared context. We can be quite sure we have little or no shared context with the way those words were once used. So we might get a bit of meaning from denotation, but we're going to be at a loss as to how much of this language struck people when they heard it initially, spoken by people who shared common cultural ground. We just can't recover a whole lot of that, and that should make our expectations somewhat modest as well. There are other things we could say about language, about translation, about orality, about the distance between folks like ourselves, fully literate people in fully literate cultures, and how different the language of Bible would sound to those who believed that they could only hear it and perhaps would only hear it once. All kinds of difficulties. We'll come back to them from time to time in the next few weeks. But for now, I want to go ahead and just say a word about common literary structures of biblical narrative. It's summarized for you on the back of your I won't dwell on these characteristics if you may. Almost all of them come from what I've just said. Given what I've said about the power of connotation, the assumption that these materials were being transmitted between people who shared connotative fields of meaning, right? The that these were people who understood the nuance of language because they didn't have to explain the common experience that stood behind that language. That it was all going to be face-to-face. If you had a question, what did you mean, you could ask it, and the person telling you could respond immediately. But this was narrated with inflection, with a shrug of the shoulders, with a gesture of the hand, all of the things that go with face-to-face communication. Well, embedded in biblical narrative today is evidence, residual, vestige, evidence that that once was the nature of engaging biblical life. No longer for the most part. But in order to do what we can with the biblical text, it's important that we at least keep in mind what these vestigial indications of the original way in which people experience these narratives can tell us about original meaning. By far, the most important of these characteristics is the condensed nature of the text. And we've talked about this in the past for sure, but let me just say a word about that now very quickly. Biblical narrative follows an extremely terse form by modern standards. This would put Hemingway, this would put Lagerfeld to shame. This is so extremely terse that we don't have comparable ways of telling story today for the most part. Highly condensed narrative, minimal use of language, economical, extremely careful use of language. Long stretches of time seem to pass without any kind of comment about intervening events. Abrupt indications of action without any suggestion of intention or underlying purpose or emotional coefficient. It would appear that biblical narrative works this way for two reasons. The first has to do directly with what I just said a moment ago. When you hear the story face to face, much of what's not in the words is in the relationship and the moment. You hear it in the voice. You see it in the way in which it's spoken. You already know the stance of the narrator. You likely have a relationship with that narrator. It may be taking place at a certain location that has something to do with the narrative. All of that implied meaning comes from the original narrative context and is obscured in a written text. And some of it, we can suspect, was a matter of artistic choice. There's a certain wager going on in this regard. And that wager is that there are certain aspects of any good story worth telling that are best left unspoken. That's an artistic consideration. Best left unspoken, because if the story's told right, what will be evoked from the listener will prove far more powerful than what might be said explicitly by the narrator. That's an artistic choice. That if I do this right, the feeling that emerges within you as a course of events unfolds will be far more powerful than any language I could supply to describe that feeling. You'll feel it. I won't have to describe the feeling. You'll feel it. I won't have to make explicit the intention. You'll know it. The reflection that goes with listening to the story is a far more effective resource for this unspoken, implicit layer of the storytelling than anything I could provide you in language. For both of those reasons, because this was face-to-face narrative and all of the things that take place when you tell another person a story or assumed, and because of this artistic consideration that there are some things that are more powerful when they're not said than when they are, biblical narratives tend to be extremely terse. The most important thing to keep in mind about that is that the responsibility for that terseness lands directly in our laps. What isn't there is nevertheless an integral part of the narrative, and it's up to us to consider carefully not only what's said, but what needs to be said. That is always part of reading biblical text. It's dangerous, it's tricky, it implies a conflict, converging and contradictory perspectives, a range of experience that people now bring to the text which isn't necessarily shared with the narrative, but there's no other way. That's the way these stories work. One more feature, the others we'll save for a little later in the series, but one more feature that I want to remind us about, that we've talked about in the past as well, which relates, once again, directly to the oral roots of Hebrew Bible, and to the fact that the psychological subtlety of this narrative style presumes that narrators can do more with what they don't say directly, at least in certain cases, than what they can state in explicit language, especially when this has to do with internal experience, emotion, intention, reflection. It's especially at those points in biblical text where we might be most eager to have something made explicit that biblical narration is most reticent to give it to us in words, especially at those points. However, the style does provide us with some assistance through techniques such as pattern repetition. As I say in the summary of this characteristic, about 100 years ago, Martin Buber gave a name to this particular device. But readers of Bible had long known that it was being employed. Buber called it Leitworte, or lead words. He took the term from Wagnerian opera, as in a leitmotif. And Buber's notion was this: when you read a biblical text, time and again, you will be confronted by the redundant use of unnecessary language. That redundant use of unnecessary language is only unnecessary if you don't appreciate that there's no such thing in Hebrew Bible as prose. It's all poetry. It was all chanted. And chanted repetition has a very important function. In fact, it has a couple of functions. First of all, it establishes coherence and continuity as the language proceeds. One of the ways that you can overcome the problem of not reading the text and going back and saying, what did that person say a moment ago, if all you have is the sound, is to periodically say the important thing again. Say it again and again. That's why songs have choruses. That's why you do a piece of the song and then you go back and sing the chorus. Well, Buber said, biblical narrative style does this all the time. Not with choruses, but with key words, Leitworte. A narrative will proceed, and then you will find a word or a phrase that you no longer can use for any informative purpose. That word doesn't give you more information, but it does draw you back to some central theme that the text is exploring. Buber says, first of all, this is an artifact of the oral roots of the style. Narrators do this to draw you back to a central theme. However, Buber said this also is a subtle technique for inducing recognition of what the narrator would rather not tell you explicitly. Hebrew Bible stories don't have titles. For the most part, they don't tell you at the outset where you're headed. And they often don't tell you what it was about at the end either. But Buber said they might be telling you in a repeated word or phrase what it's been about all along. So we're going to see that characteristic of narrative along with its highly terse and condensed form in these opening chapters in just a moment. Any questions or comments about that? We'll do the other characteristics over the course of the weeks that we're together, but those, yes, please.
I suppose an extreme of the opposite view is the Western author who describes in infinite detail his
Yes.
take on everything
Yes.
to the exasperation that you're reading it, you think to yourself, oh, I wish I could argue with this guy, but he's dead.
Yeah. Yes, yes, that's right. Biblical text expects a great deal of this. Even if it assumed in its earliest layers that the audience wasn't literate, it also assumed that the audience was made up of people who had enormous investment in listening well, listening carefully, and interpreting nuance effectively. You lived or died by your ability to do those things. And the narrative style gives us credit for being able to listen to language carefully. And to that extent, we're ruined by much of contemporary storytelling.
And you had no choice because it was drummed into you from zero age.
To listen.
I mean, you had to listen to it.
You had to listen. And if you lived in a society where for the most part you did little or no reading, listening wasn't an option. Listening was a primary street skill. You had to be able to do this or you were lost. That's right.
It seems to me that with respect to what you were talking about, the denotative and connotative uses of language, the Hebrew three-figure root
Yes.
of language is something that would be impossible for us to bring across almost, isn't it?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Dwight. One of the ways in which connotation is especially important in Hebrew is that the root system, as Dwight mentioned, three-letter roots that are the source of every term in various permutations of those three letters, creates this vast network of elusive connections. So when you hear one word in Hebrew, you are simultaneously, if you're fluent in the language, hearing a whole family of words. In English, it doesn't work well. Especially in English, it doesn't work well because English is an odd conglomeration of several languages. And if we're reading it, it works even less well because the orthography, the writing system we use now, has very little to do with anything that we recognize as the English that we speak. For all of those reasons, connotation is short-circuited in English. But connotation through this root system of related terms is everywhere. Is everywhere. Boy, okay. So the Hebrew word for story. And you'll be able to see this. I'll write the letters so you can see. Hebrew word for story is sipur. Sipur. Hebrew word for book is sefer. So far, so good. Hebrew word for haircut is mistater. That's the reflexive for what I just indicated as a source of book and telling. So how did that happen? This word actually means to, this is a recount. A recount or an accounting of something. This is a book that contains the recounting. This, mispar, same root, is a number. Because we've forgotten that recount and account come from count. But this word, mistaper, meaning to cut your hair, comes from the same root as, in English, score. Now we get a sense that there's something going on between story and counting and score. What is it? What did score mean? What did it mean to score something? How about if I said scour? It meant to
Make an impression.
It meant to cut something. To score it was to cut it, right? To score it was to cut it. When you cut your hair, you score your hair. When you score your hair, you are recounting or accounting for the number by scoring it in something. In English, they all seem disparate references today. But if you had only one system, let's say it all came from counting, let's say the root for haircut still sounded like counting. As a matter of fact, I wonder, here's a little bit of homework. I wonder if count and cut are the same word. I wonder if count and cut are the same word. If they were, then we'd have a parallel phenomenon. But in Hebrew, that's all immediate. That's all obvious. Excuse me. You can jump between those connotations within a word family gracefully, subtly. You can suggest those kinds of connections with the tip of the hair. And in English, it's much, much harder. So effective translation of the Bible has to come up against this challenge. Thanks for raising that. I appreciate that, Mike. Let me just close this morning. We will be getting to the opening chapters of the text directly next week. But let me close, finally, with some thoughts about what's distinctive about the chapters we're going to be studying. What sets the first 11 chapters of Genesis apart from the balance of Hebrew Bible? It's sometimes said that the Greek word mythos, from which we get myth, that word, it's been suggested, I believe Tillich believed this, was originally a compound word, which was mu theos, God telling. That the word mythos meant telling about God. And that the term myth today shows the imprint of that combination of mu theos, God telling. But if we take mythos in this sense, if that's what we mean by myth, very little of the Hebrew Bible is myth. That's just a fair statement. If that's what myth means, telling God, very little of what we're going to be doing is God telling. Who God is, and especially what God does when God isn't seeking to engage human beings. That just isn't within the purview of biblical narrative. They're not interested, or they don't know, but at any rate, they don't tell us. In all of the great mythic traditions of antiquity and onward, myth promised a voyeur's perspective on the gods. That's what it was good for. a keyhole on Olympus. Cosmic peep show. That's what myth provided. But the Hebrew Bible has almost nothing to narrate about the God of Israel apart from the story of the people of Israel. One of the peculiarities of the Hebrew Bible is it just doesn't seem to be interested in telling us about God apart from telling us about us. The God of the Hebrew Bible, as Abraham Joshua Heschel put it, is a God in search of man, which was a very, very strange God. In antiquity, in the varieties of great civilizations that emerged at the time the Hebrew Bible was taking form, gods at most pitied us. Once in a while threw us a scrap from the table. More often despised us, used us, exploited us, or ignored us. This biblical God inexplicably likes us. And that is odd. And this search by this God for human recognition brings the God within our range of perception. Apart from these encounters that are the result of this God seeking relationships with humans, the people of the Hebrew Bible don't go looking for this God. We don't have great quests. The great biblical figures aren't vision questers, and when they go on the vision quest, like Elijah, they are sorely disappointed. It's all about God looking for us, which is odd. Apart from these encounters and the lives of the people who experience them, their lives before and during and after, the Hebrew Bible narrates close to nothing about this God, with two exceptions: the book of Job and the first chapters of Genesis. They are the great exceptions. We're going to have to leave Job for another occasion, but I would like to take just a moment more to consider how the opening chapters are distinguished. Opening chapters of Genesis are distinguished in this regard as well. First of all, let me just say, we're used to the Bible this way. We're used to these first chapters at the beginning of the book. Apart from the moments when God and people meet in very earthly times and places on the map and times in the historical sequence, to define and refine their relationship, God is largely absent. But here, in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, God is in fact described as acting and thinking apart from us. That's exceptional. That's odd. And the people we meet and the places where we meet them and the times in which we meet them do seem different from any other particular place or time we might know. That also is different. And in this sense, the first 11 chapters of Genesis do have a mythic tone. There is something God's story about them, which will all abruptly end with chapter 12 and the story of Abraham and the covenantal history of the people of Israel. Now, I'll begin next time by saying people have long noted, before we became used to the book looking like this, that the story didn't have to begin this way. Let me give you a comparable example as I close. And that is the two genealogies of Jesus. The genealogy in Luke and the genealogy in Matthew. Isn't it odd that Luke felt compelled to start the story of Jesus with Adam? And the Gospel of Matthew is entirely comfortable saying, let's start with, say, Abraham. after those first 11 chapters. It was not a foregone conclusion among those who pondered the opening chapters of Genesis and Antiquity that the account would begin this way, that it would begin at the beginning. And that should give us pause and lead us to begin next week our conversation with the question, if these opening chapters are in fact seen as a kind of author's prologue, forward to the book proper, what let there be light might they shed on all that follows? So we're going to begin next week by thinking about the opening chapters of Genesis in Babel. Thank you.
I love to gloat, but I think we've established that this is a program that needs to continue, and it's a great thing that we don't have to say goodbye after 2 weeks.